Okay, good morning, everyone. Before we begin, are there any questions? Anything that anyone wants to raise? Any issues? No? Okay. So today we're just going to do the last slide basically of the money market. We're going to recap what the money market looks like and do a question about the sorry? No? Okay. And do a question about the what's it called? The quantity theory of money. And then we're going to move on to chapter 27. Then what we can do next week is we'll also go through the tutorials that I'm not sure how many you've now completed that we haven't gone through. Is it 1 or 2? No, I don't think so. So you're saying that by the end of this week you will have completed 3 that we haven't gone through? Really? How many? So there's a deadline for 1 today, right? Or this week sometime? Or is it next week? Next week, yeah, okay, so that's fine. Will that have been 3 at the end of next week? Okay, so that's fine. So then what we'll do is when we come back eventually we'll go through, it'll be 3 tutorials, basically, that, if I understand, that we need to catch up on. Or, it's just going to be 1. It's just the 1 at the end of next week that we haven't gone through yet. Oh, okay, it's 1. Maybe, maybe you missed a lecture or something? Did you miss a lecture? I don't know. Anyway, we'll figure it out. Okay. Next week, we'll figure it out which one it is. Next week, Friday. Not next week, sorry, the week after Friday. So next week is the break, right? Is it not? It is, right? Or is it the week after next? Okay. Okay, one of these weeks, I'll have to check the calendar. My mind is a little bit... Sorry? From the 8th. Okay, cool. Yeah, so then next week we will do the tutorials and then there'll be a break and then we'll worry about it after that. After the break will be the other test, the, what do you call it, the written test. Yeah, it's in your calendar somewhere, but it's after the break. So we'll talk about it, we can talk about it next week and we don't need it now. It should say in the handbook, but I would imagine it's 1 to 25. I mean, I wouldn't see why it wouldn't be 25. Maybe even 27 as well. Yeah, life moves on. Huh? It's always going forward. Okay, so the money market, if you recall, we had a money supply curve and we had a money demand curve. The money supply curve is an upward sloping curve, but we've also seen, at least in one other textbook diagram, that it is vertical. And as I said, if we look forward to chapter 31, you see that in fact they do draw the money supply curve as being perfectly vertical. The difference between upward sloping and perfectly vertical is just dependent on whether the banking system, commercial banks, whether you want to model commercial banks influencing money supply. Okay, so if it's upward sloping, like this, then we've got the commercial banking system involved. If we imagine it's just vertical, then we're basically saying ignore the commercial banking system and just imagine like the Reserve Bank controls the entire money supply. Okay? So vertical is basically the component that is controlled by the central bank, and the upward sloping component is the component that's controlled by the commercial banking system. Okay? So our money market, upward sloping, money supply, downward sloping, money demand. So I did mention that we would be talking about I did mention we'd be talking about the real money market, okay? So in other words, we're dealing with real money demand and real money supply, okay? When prices change, real money demand does not change. When prices change, real money supply does change. Okay? The example I gave yesterday was saying, imagine we had R1 trillion worth of money in the economy, so the money supply was at 1 trillion rand, and prices went up, then that 1 trillion rand would buy less real goods and services. Remember this? Okay, so when prices go up, okay, so we'll say if prices increase, what happens? Real money supply decreases. In other words, real money supply will shift to the left. Okay? What's going to happen to our equilibrium? Equilibrium interest rates will increase. Okay? And the quantity of money held in the economy will decrease. Okay, so if prices increase, money supply shifts. Money demand, no change. Okay, remember this is real money demand and real money supply. We ended yesterday speaking about the quantity theory of money. I mentioned that the quantity theory of money is essentially represented by this equation, Py equals MV. P is prices, Y is real output, M is nominal money supply, and V is velocity of money. Velocity of money meaning the number of times each unit of money is used in a transaction, or will be used in a transaction during some period. So during the period that we are measuring the amount of output that was produced, if we say that the amount of real output produced was 10,000 units of output, and we know that the nominal money supply was 100,000, and we know that the price level is 100, then our velocity, in other words, the number of times that each unit of money is circulated or used in a transaction is 10. So just briefly reading through these points then. In the long run, the price level adjusts to make the quantity of real money demanded equal to the quantity supplied. Okay? So what we usually assume is that V here, velocity, is fairly constant, so we can just call it fixed. So velocity fixed. So I've got a bar above the V there to mean that the value of velocity is fixed. So the value of velocity of money is fixed. Then the quantity theory of money says that in the long run, the price level adjusts to make the quantity of real money demanded equal to the quantity supplied. The quantity theory of money is a special theory of price level and inflation that explains this long-run adjustment of the price level. Okay? So if our nominal value of money does not change, so if the Reserve Bank doesn't print any additional money, or the banking system doesn't create any additional money through granting loans, if we assume that the nominal value of money is fixed and the velocity of money remains constant, then if the real value of output increases, so we start producing more and more goods and services, okay? And people need to buy those goods and services. If we assume this component here is fixed and this component here is fixed, what would make this equation balance? There's only one other variable that can adjust, and that is price level, right? So if this side goes up, what must happen to prices to make this side go up? Prices must go down. Okay? Let's look at this equation and ask a slightly different question. If the amount of output produced remains the same, okay? So if we assume that that's fixed for now, and that's a fairly straightforward assumption to make, because remember, production takes labor, capital, and a whole bunch of other inputs. Okay? So if we assume in the very short run those are fixed, okay, we're not going to get another machine to produce more goods in the next month. We're not going to be able to hire people maybe that we want in the next month, right? And we're not going to be able to get the inputs that we need, let's say, for at least 1 month, okay? Then we can assume that output is, say, fixed for at least a month. You happy with that idea? Okay, so if output was fixed for a short while, velocity is constant, and the amount of money printed by the Reserve Bank increases, okay? So this side of the equation does not change. This variable doesn't change, but this side, the M goes up. How would we balance these two sides of the equation? The only variable that's going to change, once again, is P. What should happen to P? So, okay, we're not talking about an increase in Y anymore. We're saying Y stays constant and M increases. What's going to keep that equation balanced, given that Y remains the same and V remains the same? P should change. What's going to happen to P? Sorry? Okay, who says P should decrease? Who says P should increase? Who has no idea? Okay, so it's a simple maths equation here, right? Let's give values. Let's say that output is 100, okay? Prices were, I'm running out of space here, hang on. Okay, so let's say output is 100, and that's equal to the general price level is, let's say, 10. The velocity is, say, 10. Therefore, what is the amount of money that must be in this economy to make this equation balance? Are you with me? Okay. Now I'm saying imagine M, the amount of money increases. It's no longer going to be 100, it's 200. Okay. This is fixed. This is fixed. If prices change, what's going to make that equation balance? Prices should go up. What should prices go up to? 20. Now our equation balances again, right? Okay, so the quantity theory of money has a very specific policy statement, makes a specific policy statement. If you increase the amount of money, what is that going to lead to? An increase in prices. In other words, inflation. So the quantity theory of money says when you print money, what do you end up with? Inflation. Print money equals inflation. That's what the quantity theory of money says. Okay? So if you want to stimulate your economy by printing money, you're going to end up with inflation. Okay? So in the long run, the price level adjusts to make the quantity of real money demanded equal the quantity supplied. In other words, the quantity of money demanded is the quantity of money demanded for transactions. Okay? And then there's the amount supplied. Quantity theory of money is a special theory of the price level and inflation that explains this long-run adjustment of the price level. This proposes that in the long run, an increase in the quantity of money brings an equal percentage increase in the price level. The velocity of circulation is the average number of times a specific rand is used annually to buy the goods and services that make up GDP. And as I say, we assume that this remains fairly constant. But GDP equals the price level multiplied by real GDP. So this should actually say nominal. Sorry, nominal GDP. Nominal GDP equals the price level multiplied by real GDP. Okay, so those are the specific. So that's a summary of our quantity theory of money in words, but it really just evolves around this equation. Rearranging that equation is what leads us to the suggestion that when you increase the money supply, the price level adjusts. So then to end off that section. We have one last question, and then we are done with chapter 25. I'll make it slightly bigger. You've got your text with you, so towards the end of chapter 25, you'll see the discussion on the quantity theory, and I'll give you 2 minutes to work through this. Which of the following is incorrect regarding the quantity theory? Okay? It's up to you. Go for it. As I say, I'll give you 5 minutes, and then we'll have a quick chat, and then we'll move on to chapter 27. You guys done? You done? You got an answer? Yeah? Think so? Okay. Okay, shall we go through it? You ready? Okay. 4A. Real GDP is not influenced by the quantity of money in terms of the quantity theory. Are you happy with that? Real GDP is not influenced by the quantity of money. Is that correct in terms of the quantity theory of money? Yes? Why? What happens when we change the quantity of money? Changes in the price level are usually the result of changes in the quantity of money, right? Real GDP is not what gets influenced by quantity of money. Okay, option B, real GDP is equal to nominal GDP multiplied by the quantity of money. No. Real GDP would be the quantity of money, nominal GDP would be the quantity of money the quantity of money times the velocity, right? There's nothing about velocity, but okay, or real GDP is equal to the quantity of money times velocity divided by the price level. Either of those would be correct. Option C, in the long run, an increase in the quantity of money results in an equal percentage increase in the price level. Yeah? We just saw that on the previous slide. In the long run, an increase in the quantity of money brings an equal percentage increase in the price level. And option E, countries with high growth rates of money will have high inflation rates. Okay. Any questions about that stuff? Or anything in chapter 25, really? Because otherwise, that's chapter 25 done. We wrap that up. Yeah, it's not that important. But sorry, the question was, just to recap, remember we said there are a number of different measures of money from M0 to M3. And as we move from M0 to M3, we become, the kind of money we're talking about is becoming less and less liquid. So M0 is the most liquid, M3 is the least liquid. Okay? M0 being the most liquid because it is cash, right? And when we say it's the most liquid, we mean that it's immediately available to exchange for goods and services, right? You can use it there and then. So M0 is basically an emphasis on money as a medium of exchange. There you're holding money to exchange it. When you get down to M3, it's not as liquid, which means we can't use it right now to exchange for goods and services. We have to wait for some period of time, which means we're not really holding it now for the medium of exchange function. We're holding it more for the store of value function. So that's the distinction as we move from M0 down to M3. Okay, any other questions about chapter 25? No? Okay. So we are skipping chapter 26 for now. We will come back to chapter 26 later. And we move on to chapter 27. Okay, so the pace of everything that we've been doing has been kind of fairly slow, maybe picking up slightly, but now you're going to find that the pace starts picking up even more. After we've done chapter 27, we move on to chapter 28 and chapter 29, and as we move through these chapters, we start bringing everything that we've done before together into these chapters and start looking at pictures where something changes in one market and it has impacts in all the other markets. Okay? So if you don't know how one particular market works, if you don't know the factors that shift the curves, then the wheels start falling off. Okay? Because changes in one market start having influences on other markets. And you need to understand how all of those things fit together. So we've looked at a labor market. The labor market's connected to production. We've looked at the money market. Now we're going to start looking at the goods market. Okay? And once we bring the goods market together with aggregates, so the goods market is looking, the first side is, the goods market, when we start looking at it here, we're looking at it from the demand side. When we looked at the labor market, we were looking at the supply side of the goods market, but we never actually took it into supply. Here we start looking at the demand side of the goods market, and we're going to take it into demand. Okay? So this model here, the Keynesian model, is going to be the basis for determining the aggregate demand in the goods market. Okay? The labor market is the foundation for the aggregate supply side of the goods market. So here we're talking about expenditure now, and things start getting a little bit complicated. I think just people get very confused. For good reason. There's a lot of ways in which you can get confused. The first thing that I want to do, though, is discuss the difference, I guess, in microeconomics. You had two types of time period. You had the short run and you had the long run. And can you remember what distinguished the short run from the long run in microeconomics? Cool. That is excellent. So, the way that we distinguish the short run from the long run in microeconomics was essentially we said there are two factors in the production process. There's capital and there's labor. And in the short run, we assume that capital is basically fixed and labor can vary. In the long run, capital can vary and labor can vary. So the main difference between the short run and the long run was where the capital was fixed. Does that ring a bell? Sort of. Macroeconomics, we also talk about a short run and a long run, but it's not the same kind of definition that applied to microeconomics. So this is the first point to get around. We talk about the short run, we talk about the long run, but we could also talk about, I guess, the very short run and the very long run, although those are never explicitly described. So what happens when we're dealing with macroeconomics is we've got the same kind of variables. We've got, let's begin here in the short run. We've got capital as part of our production process. We've got labor, but we're also interested in prices of goods and services, and we're interested in real wages. So that's real wages is nominal wages divided by the price level. Okay? So when we deal with the short run, basically capital does remain fixed. Okay? Labor can vary, but not labor supply. Okay? Labor can vary, like the quantity of labor being used can vary, but not the labor supply in total. In other words, we're not saying the population changes in the short run. So I'm going to put a little fixed over here, but bear in mind when I say fixed there, what I mean by fixed is labor supply, the total. Okay? Not the quantity of labor that we can employ, but the actual total labor supply. Prices can vary, and real wages can vary. When we deal with the long run, we tend to say, okay, fine, capital is fixed, labor, again, this is total labor, is fixed. Prices can vary, but real wages are fixed. Real wages don't change. Okay? So you can see that's not quite the same distinction as we made between the long and the short run in micro. When we deal with the very long run, then we have, okay, capital can vary, total amount of labor available can vary, prices can vary, real wages can vary. Okay, so in the very long run, everything can vary. And in the very short run, well, we tend to say that capital is fixed, labor is fixed, prices are fixed, real wages fixed, we don't worry about those. Okay? So, what I'm going to just kind of say, in both the long and the short run, labor supply can vary. Oh, let me just, hang on. Labor supply, or let's do it like this. Quantity of labor can vary. Okay, so quantity of labor employed, but the labor supply curve does not. Does that make sense? So we can have a movement along our labor supply curve, but the labor supply curve stays fixed. In the very long run, within our labor supply curve can also shift. So I have put all of those sort of in one place together here, and then you will almost invariably forget about that because, as I say, there's a lot to remember and things get very confusing. So this is probably not one of those things that you will remember, but we will come back to it as we go through. Just, I will remind you, right? We're dealing with these things being fixed and these things being variable depending on what we're looking at, okay? So when we deal with this Keynesian model here, okay, we are basically dealing with a very short run story, okay? So for now, we're assuming capital's fixed, labor's fixed, prices are fixed, real wages are fixed. So let me just add another. Okay, so quantity of labor can vary, but not the labor supply. Okay. As we move into the next few slides, there will be some more confusing stuff which we'll talk through. So what are we going to do in chapter 27? We're going to explain how planned expenditure is determined when the price level is fixed. So I've mentioned already, right? We're dealing with this kind of very short run. Just imagine everything is basically fixed. We're going to explain and illustrate how real GDP is determined when the price level is fixed. So there's some kind of a distinction we're going to make between planned expenditure and real GDP. That might be a little bit confusing because remember we measure GDP in terms of an expenditure approach, right? But now we're going to say that in fact expenditure and real GDP are not necessarily always the same. Okay? Confusing? Yes, potentially. I'm saying there's a difference. Before we said that output we just measured in terms of expenditure. Now we're going to separate those two things. We're going to say output in fact is a supply side thing. And expenditure is a demand side thing. And expenditure could be equal to output, but it might not be equal to output. Okay? We're going to calculate the values of the various expenditure components when the price level is fixed. So what are our various expenditure components? Even more confusing, the expenditure components are right? So we're going to see that C plus I plus X minus M, sometimes it's equal to Y, sometimes it's not. Okay? Explain, illustrate, and calculate the expenditure multiplier when the price level is fixed. So we can introduce something here called the expenditure multiplier. And then explain the relationship between aggregate expenditure and aggregate demand. So remember what I said ultimately was that we were going to use this chapter to basically derive aggregate demand. Okay? So that's where we're going at the end of this chapter. We're going to describe demand in the goods market. And then we're going to explain how the multiplier changes, explain the multiplier when the price level changes. So right at the end of this chapter, we are going to change the price level. So for the whole chapter, we're talking about the very short run, and then towards the end of the chapter, we move into the short run. Okay? We start letting prices as well as wages, so the price of labor vary as well. Okay. So, fixed prices and planned expenditures. So just, again, emphasized in the setup here, each firm has prices and they're going to be fixed, so therefore the price level is fixed. Okay. And in this model, we're just dealing with demand side. Okay, so when we talk about real GDP, we're not worried about how GDP gets produced in this chapter. We just assume that there's some level of production. Okay, remember, it's the very short run. We assume that capital and labor is fixed. There's just some level of output being produced. Okay? And what we want to know is what happens when the amount that people want to buy is not equal to the amount that people are producing. Okay? So we've got aggregate demand and we've got real GDP. It says the Keynesian model explains fluctuations in aggregate demand at a fixed price level by identifying the forces that determine planned expenditure. What do we mean by planned expenditure? First of all, aggregate expenditure, in other words, the sum of all expenditure in the economy, has four components, which we have seen before. Consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports, so exports minus imports. The difference between our total aggregate planned expenditure and, the difference between our total aggregate expenditure and our aggregate planned expenditure, okay, is that the amount that we spend is not necessarily equal to the amount that we plan to spend, okay? And the amount that we will plan to spend is also made up of consumption, investment, government spending, and exports minus imports. So how do these two differ is the key question. And I will leave, so it says, let me leave that question. How do they differ? Oops. Okay? And we will answer that in a moment. First of all, let's understand that there's a two-way link between our expenditure and the real GDP, in other words, the amount of output that's produced. There's a two-way link between aggregate planned expenditure and real GDP, which says that an increase in real GDP increases aggregate expenditure, but an increase in aggregate expenditure also increases real GDP. Sounds bizarre. How does that work? Well, what we end up with in this particular chapter, and there's no, in these slides here, there are no equations, but when we get to these graphs are built on these equations, and the equations are basically, I think in the appendix, if I recall, let me just double check. The appendix of chapter 27 is where they kind of put a lot of emphasis on the equations. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just being useless here. Yeah, so in the appendix is where these equations are, okay? So previously, in chapter 21, when we were measuring GDP, we said that we can measure GDP by adding up all the components of expenditure, aggregate expenditure, okay? In this chapter here, chapter 27, we are going to say aggregate expenditure is indeed equal to, why is it doing that? All the components of expenditure, but aggregate expenditure itself may or may not be equal to the amount of actual output. Okay? So that's the difference between chapter 21 and chapter 27, and I'm just running out of space here quickly. What we are going to say in this chapter is that consumption expenditure is a function of your income. Okay? Therefore, the amount that you can consume is going to be determined by an equation which is written like this. Okay? Which says the amount that you consume is determined by your income. But also there's some amount of consumption that you will always want to consume no matter what your income is. Okay? In other words, even if you are earning no money, you will still want to consume. Does that make sense? Regardless of whether you have any money or have earned any money as income, you will still want to purchase some sorts of goods and services. You have to eat, right? So your consumption expenditure, you will always want to consume some amount of goods and services, even if you don't earn any income. But as soon as you start earning income, right? Then it's party time. Okay? And what this little b over here is telling us is, usually this b is, we assume that it's less than 1. So, you will consume some portion of your income, but you don't necessarily consume all of your income. So let's say you got paid 100 Rand, and of every 100 Rand you earn, you are quite happy to blow 50 Rand on that, on having fun, buying the stuff you want to buy. Right? If you're happy to blow 50 Rand of that, then the proportion of your income that you would be spending would be, that's right, 0.5. Okay? And then let's say there's some amount that you always want to spend anyway. Let's say you were going to spend 30 Rand on food. What would your total consumption be if your income was 100? You happy with that? Okay. So if you were earning income of 100, your consumption would be 80. What do you think happens to the other 20? Save it. Right? You save some portion of your income. Of course, if my income was not 100, if my income was something more like 20, what would my consumption be? If income was 20, what would consumption be? 40. If income was 20, consumption would be 40. How could I spend 40 if my income was only 20? What's happening to my savings? They're going down. So when my income is greater than my consumption, what's happening to my savings? They're going up. When my income is less than my consumption, what's happening to my savings? They must be going down. Right? I must either be taking money that I've previously saved, or I must be borrowing from someone. And then I've got negative savings. Right? My savings have gone below zero. I've now borrowed. At this point, I haven't spoken about taxes, but we will talk about taxes. Absolutely, yeah. So now that we've brought in taxes, we've got an appetite for making things more complicated. Fantastic. Let's do that. Let's add taxes into that equation. We consume after we've been taxed. Right? You first got to pay your taxes, then you can spend your money. Okay? And if you spend the money before you pay the taxes, the tax man does not care. He still wants his money. Tax is an interesting subject if you have any... if you're interested in the way the world works. Tax is one of the things that has shaped the way we live today. The kind of society we have, you can follow tax law basically, and you can see how society gets shaped by tax laws. So the introduction of parliament as a system of governance within a democracy was basically introduced, its seeds were introduced via a tax revolt. Okay? It was a revolt against a tax system that introduced the parliamentary system. Right? Tax revolts are what brought down the French monarchy, the French Revolution, tax revolt. And what the tax man is the arm of the treasury, which is the arm of the executive. Okay? And the arm of the executive that takes that money is backed up by the legal system. So if the executive holds the legal system can make any kind of tax law legal, right? Whether it's legal doesn't necessarily mean it's just. And when a tax law is not just, then you tend to have tax revolts, right? So what does the tax system do, or what does it mean? Well, how about this as one example of the South African Revenue Service? When you are in a supply chain, when you purchase goods from someone, okay, let's say, and I'll use the example of Massmart because this example is exactly about Massmart. So Massmart purchases whatever it wants, ladders, toys, paint. Imagine, so Macro is part of Massmart. Anything Macro sells, Macro doesn't make those things, right? Macro purchases them from, for example, a manufacturer or from some other retailer, okay? So the manufacturer makes the goods. When the manufacturer sells those goods to Massmart, the taxman goes to the manufacturer and says, great, pay me tax on the value of your sales. And the producer must pay tax to the taxman, right? Pays tax to SARS. Massmart, when it buys those goods and services, the price that it buys them at includes tax, right? It buys them with the tax included. So when Massmart sells its goods and services, it deducts the tax, the input tax, right? And then pays tax on the value added. So it pays tax on the amount that it sells, right? Less the input costs and less the input tax. So what the South African Revenue Service does is it collects tax from the manufacturer and then it collects tax again from Massmart. It taxes the manufacturer on the value added when it manufactured, and it taxes Massmart on the value added when it sells. So when Massmart buys something for 100 Rand and sells it for 200 Rand, right? It doesn't pay tax on 200 Rand, it pays tax on 100 Rand, okay? The original manufacturer pays tax on the first 100 Rand, Massmart pays tax on the second 100 Rand. Okay? If you've got 14%, the original manufacturer pays 14 Rand to the taxman. Massmart pays 14 Rand to the taxman, right? Except when it sells its goods for 200 Rand, the VAT on 200 Rand is 14%, 28, right? But Massmart doesn't pay 28 Rand to the SARS, because 14 Rand of that 28 has already been paid by the manufacturer. You get it? So Massmart owed the taxman tax. Okay? And it had purchased a bunch of goods from the original manufacturers. The original manufacturers went out of business. Okay? They were liquidated. They could not pay SARS the tax. So SARS went to Massmart and said, cool, they can't pay us the tax, pay us the tax. What do you think Massmart did? They paid the tax. Why do you think Massmart paid the tax? Have you heard anything about this guy? What's his name? I think it's Dave King. Anyone heard about this guy, King? Okay, so King has a business. And there's like a tax loophole. Okay? So by doing his business in a certain way, he can avoid paying tax. Not evade, avoid. Okay? So avoid paying tax means you don't pay tax because in terms of the law, you don't have to pay tax. Okay? So he organizes his system in such a way that he can avoid paying tax. But the amount of tax he avoids paying is like 1 billion Rand. So SARS is not happy with this. Okay? So he says, cool, take me to court. Right? King's got enough money, right, to go to court. SARS says, sweet. King's going to hire fancy advocates, right? I mean, we're talking about 1 billion Rand here. I think it was 1 billion Rand. Okay. They go to court. SARS says, no, we're not ready. We're just going to delay. Dave pays his lawyers, right? Next time, no, we're delaying. Dave pays his lawyers. Delaying, pays his lawyers. Delaying, pays his lawyers. After 10 years, Dave says, okay, fine. I'll pay your tax. And SARS comes back, cool. Well, you owed that tax, and we've had 10 years now of the interest on that tax we would have earned. That's what we want. So the taxman comes to Massmart and says, pay us the money. Massmart just says, okay, cool. Take the money. Yeah, we can take a break. Sorry, I've got one more story for you if you're interested in SARS though, and tax. So there's a guy, he's employed by his employer, okay? When you're employed, your employer by law has to deduct the money from your salary and pay it to SARS and only pay you, after tax. That's what they have to. So this guy gets paid by his company. The company goes out of business. The company does not pay tax to SARS. SARS turns around to the guy and says, pay us your tax. The guy says, I've already paid my tax. I paid it to the company. The company was your appointed collection agent. You've got a problem with your collection agent. That's not my problem. I didn't appoint him. You appointed him. By law, you appointed him. How is this my problem? I don't know what the outcome of the tax case was. It was a couple of years ago, and I never followed it up. But that was in the courts. Yeah. SARS will get you. And they don't give a... Anyway, cool. So we'll take a break and then we can come back. Yo. Yes.
The woman who got accidentally got 14 million, right?
Yes.
If she invested into stocks or something,
Yes.
or whatever, let's say betting, she won money.
Yes.
That money that she won,
Yes.
would she have to pay that back as well?
I doubt it. I don't think so. Yeah?
What is your view about it? Like,
Oh, that's
this
an audio.
whole situation?
Let's go with this one. Yeah.
Because what's the difference between finding money on the floor
Yeah.
and what happened to her?
Well, the difference is she knows where that money came from.
Oh,
So what's the difference between someone parking their car in your driveway and then you just drive off?
yes, okay, yeah.
So she knows where that money came from.
Yes,
And everyone else knows where that money came from. It wasn't her money, but she spent it. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.